successive pharaohs. And one of the things we've been doing is exploring this huge terrain around the tomb of Senwosret III. You'll notice that this sort of T-shaped enclosure that contains the entrance to his tomb is flanked by a whole series of other buildings. And particularly in this area up here, on the northeastern side of this enclosure of Senwosret III, we have some other very large structures, two really massive tombs that we have investigated recently. They've been known, in fact, the existence of these has been known for well over 100 years, and there was some early work done by the Egypt Exploration Fund, the British Egyptological Research Organization, back in 1902, 1903. They sort of plumbed down into the centers of these structures and made sort of basic plans of the architecture that they could see at that point. We've returned to those. One of my collaborators, a former student, Don McCormack, has been examining this structure, what we call Tomb S9, a really massive structure with a huge subterranean burial chamber cut way down into the bedrock. And then this one over here, we've just completed the excavation of that this summer. At this point, we have, in fact, not entirely conclusive evidence, but very strong indications for a really fascinating phenomenon, which appears to be a group of very important kings who reign in the middle part of a dynasty called the 13th dynasty. These are three kings who are brothers. The first of them is a king by the name of Neferhotep, or Neferhotep I. You can see he's identified there tentatively with this tomb S9. For those of you familiar with the Oriental Institute's Egyptian collection, there's a beautiful statue thought to belong to Neferhotep I on display in the Egyptian gallery, which I was a little bit disappointed to see when I went in there this evening, is now on loan to the Metropolitan Museum for their Middle Kingdom exhibition, but there's a photo of it, at least, on display. This is the same king whose statue from Abydos exists in your own museum here. We believe he was buried at Abydos. He's one of a group of three brothers who we know quite a lot about their family. Neferhotep is the eldest of the brothers. He was then succeeded by a very ephemeral, mysterious individual named Sa-Hathor. And recent evidence suggests that they may in fact have begun a tomb at Anubis Mountain for this second brother named Sa-Hathor that was abandoned. It was never completed because his reign seems to have lasted not more than about 6 months. Some people suggest he never even took the throne officially. But there's an abandoned complex, and then another one that we call S10 that we've gathered recent evidence very strongly suggesting it belongs to the third of these three brothers. His name is Sobek Hotep, and we know him as Sobek Hotep IV. These were very powerful kings who had origins in southern Egypt. They were very active at Abydos, and we have major construction activity in the area of the great Osiris temple. These guys were very dedicated, in fact, to Abydos, and we'll take a look at them again in a little bit as well. So Senwosret III establishes this place. He builds his monstrous tomb beneath Anubis Mountain. Later kings, quite possibly these three brothers, Neferhotep and Sa-Hathor, briefly, and then Sobek Hotep IV seem to have been inspired to add their own tombs. And then finally, somewhat later, we have this group of kings in the Second Intermediate Period, including Senebkai and these other ones that you see here, adding their own tombs. So we have a group of tombs, some of them identified. We have names we can associate with them, definitely, and in some cases, probably. We have other ones that are still entirely anonymous. And I think there are probably more of them because this is a huge landscape. You see the enclosure of Senwosret III here that includes the entrance to his subterranean tomb that goes beneath Anubis Mountain. There's big empty areas that are still actually unexplored within this. There may be additional tombs. We've done ground-penetrating radar in an attempt to try and determine what might be beneath the very deep sand deposits in this area. We know there's some kind of an anomaly, in fact, in this enclosure on the other side, sort of balancing the entrance to the tomb of Senwosret III. There may be another kind of large subterranean structure, possibly another tomb. We have some other very impressive buildings. These ones that you see here, we've actually spent quite a lot of time excavating, and we actually don't know what they are at all. They're probably also royal structures, possibly additional royal tombs, but they remain question marks. So we're exploring this place, but in the last 2 to 3 years, it's really become increasingly obvious how important this place was to the ancient Egyptians. Let's begin with a look at this massive tomb of Senwosret III beneath Anubis Mountain. This has been a long-term project of mine. My wife it's one of the loves of my life, I have to say. My wife calls it Joe's folly. The process of excavating this tomb has taken us at this point well over 10 years. What you see is an isometric, a cutaway of the architecture of this gigantic tomb that's cut into the deserts, down into the bedrock. There's no superstructure above it. It's entirely subterranean, and the interior of it extends at a depth of about 100 feet from the desert surface, where you see these men working directly beneath the mountain. This is a very fascinating monument built during a period where we have one of the wealthiest, most powerful kings of the height of Egypt's Middle Kingdom. There we see him, Senwosret III. His reign is about 1850 BC. We know that this king had a lot of interest in the site of Abydos. One of the reasons for that is the cultic and religious focus of Greater Abydos on the cult of this particular deity, the god Osiris, who is the sort of premier funerary deity in ancient Egypt, the king of the netherworld, the pharaoh of the afterlife. Abydos was his principal cult center. And the Middle Kingdom is one of the classical eras of the development of this place. Senwosret III built extensively, he and other pharaohs of this era, up here in the north part of Abydos, where there was a temple complex dedicated to Osiris. He was interested in developing the activities associated with an annual procession that ran from the Osiris temple out here to a site called El Gab today, which is, in ancient times, the burial place of Egypt's first pharaohs, the pharaohs of the first dynasty and some kings of the second dynasty were buried here, and in later times the Egyptians believed Osiris himself was buried there, and so there was a procession that connected his temple with his presumed burial place. Senwosret III seems to have developed particular interest in the cult of Osiris, and he decided, for some reason, to build this tomb there. But when he did so, he already had another tomb. Senwosret III is one of a handful of Egyptian pharaohs who have given us a little bit of a conundrum because he has multiple burial places. In the Middle Kingdom, pharaohs were still building pyramids, and every king of the 12th dynasty built a pyramid up in northern Egypt near the capital city called Itchatawi. Senwosret III's pyramid, which you see here, is at a site called Dashur. And we know that he had largely completed this in the first decade and a half of his reign. But then he builds this other tomb in southern Egypt at the site of Abydos, this monster tomb beneath Anubis Mountain. So there's many interesting questions that, of course, come up. Why was he motivated to build a second tomb? Was one of these intended to be the actual burial place, and the other one then becomes purely a sort of a symbolic tomb? Many people in the past have thought that this tomb at Abydos was what we call a cenotaph, just a symbolic tomb. It was never actually used for the king's burial. So in excavating it, we're addressing these questions and certain other ones about the significance of this place. We knew that the tomb existed back when we started excavation right above the entrance to it in 2004. And the reason we knew about it is that it had been actually discovered slightly over 100 years ago, back in 1904, or 1902, 1903, sorry. The British Egypt Exploration Fund had one of the young colleagues of the very famous excavator Flinders Petrie had been working in this area, and he had discovered the entrance to this tomb and did a sort of a cursory examination of it. But then it sanded up and it was not accessible until we began work there in 2004. It had never been properly excavated. There were a lot of questions about what this tomb represents. Is it a tomb or a cenotaph? Was the king buried at Abydos? Is his interest in Osiris so significant that he chose this as his burial place? Certain aspects of the architecture that we knew about at that time suggested this tomb is a very important kind of transitional monument that links the earlier pyramid tradition in Egypt with the emergence of a new form of royal burial place in which they abandon the built pyramid superstructure and gravitate towards the natural landscape. And that's what we see in this case. There's no standing superstructure, but rather the symbolic mountain of Anubis rising up above the tomb. So we've been excavating it. We reopened it after about 9 months of excavation, going down through the desert sands. In the winter of 2005, 2006, we reopened the tomb. And this is what I often call my best Christmas present ever. It was basically Christmas Day, I guess it was 2005. And within a day or two of that date, we actually reopened the tomb and gained access to the interior. Since that time, we have been progressively working our way inwards, systematically excavating this gigantic tomb. And it's been a huge job. The first thing one has to contend with in a tomb like this, of course, is the guardians. You have to pass through the guarded entranceway. There you just see three of the workers. My workers love this part of the site more than any other. It's an area where a lot of sort of machismo comes out amongst the workers as we grapple with massive fallen blocks of masonry and huge amounts of material in this monstrous monument. Anyway, this is the actual entrance to this tomb of Senwosret III. This monument is a tremendous feat of architectural engineering. It's cut into the bedrock, goes down 100 feet below the desert surface. And not only that, they didn't just hew it, cut it into the bedrock, but they brought thousands and thousands of tons of masonry blocks, beautiful limestone blocks, others of quartzite and granite, thousands of tons from hundreds of miles away. It all was brought to this place and brought underground and fitted to this tomb. So this architecture you see here, this is not the bedrock. It's walls created out of massive limestone blocks that have been fitted within the cut space in the bedrock. So it's a really kind of remarkable monument. It's one that we found in a relatively damaged condition because ancient tomb robbers had in fact entered it, and they had significantly damaged extensive areas of it. So one of the things we've been contending with, of course, is huge fallen blocking stones and a lot of rock debris and other material that is the result of the tomb robbery process. But we've been systematically working through this room by room for the last 10 years. And this is the space you just saw in the process of excavation. That now looks like this. You can see the floor of it in this beautiful, what we call the pole roof ceiling, a simulation of the appearance of wooden logs, but created instead out of limestone, blocks of limestone that have been carved to appear like wooden logs spanning the width of the chamber. So just a few views of this tomb in the process of excavation. Here, this is the same space I just showed you, what we call the pole roof chamber, an amazing space. The first chamber as you enter the tomb itself. There's just a detail of this beautiful carved ceiling. As you go into the tomb, one of the things that is very obvious is the tremendous effort that was put into very intricate systems of blocking and concealing the succession from section to section as you progress into the inner burial compartments of Senwosret III. There's a lot of areas that are actually open passageways, like this one that you see here,